When Luke suggested spending the weekend at his stepfather George's house, I initially saw it as an unexpected but perfectly reasonable idea. Our apartment in San Francisco had long ceased to be a place of comfort and warmth. It felt more like an office bathed in neon light. Luke was almost constantly glued to work, his late-night calls and early morning meetings becoming the soundtrack of our lives. This weekend was a beacon of hope for me, a chance to reclaim something that seemed to be slipping away from us. We set off early in the morning, but the sunlight was already blazing against the car's windshield. The hustle and bustle of the city were left behind as the concrete gave way to rolling green hills and dusty trails. I gazed out the window at the serene mountains etched against the horizon, as if promising peace. Each mile took us further away from the city's relentless rhythm, but Luke's distant expression, fixed on the road ahead, reminded me that distance alone cannot heal disagreements. George has always been like that, Luke suddenly said, his hands steady on the wheel. Like what? I asked, unable to hide my surprise at his unexpected candor. Composed, I guess. Always knows what he wants. I think you'll like his house. It's unique. His voice carried a mix of irritation and envy that he didn't bother to conceal. I didn't know how to respond. The conversation fizzled out as quickly as it had started. Luke refocused on the road, and I sank into my thoughts. Was this trip to George's an attempt by Luke to find answers to his own questions? Or was he simply escaping the pressures of his job in San Francisco, leaving me to wonder where we were headed, not just in a literal sense, but also as a couple? When we turned onto a country road, the scenery came to life. Ancient oaks, their gnarled branches seeming to embrace the sky, stretched their shadows across the path. The dirt road climbed upward, and with every turn, I felt we were leaving behind not only the city, but also something intangible within ourselves. Finally, we arrived at George's house. It was unassuming, a wooden facade wrapped in ivy with a wide porch and a rocking chair on the front steps. I spotted George right away, even from the car. Tall, with a full head of silver hair, he stood with his arms crossed, breaking into a broad, genuine smile as soon as he saw us. There was something instantly captivating about him. Perhaps his self-assurance, so rare in men his age, or the warm way he looked at both of us. "Hey, you made it!" His voice rang out, strong and welcoming. I stepped out of the car, barely managing a hello before George strode over, giving me a firm handshake. "Kate, I've heard so much about you. It's great to finally meet you." His words felt genuine, as though I were a long-awaited guest. Luke stood still, offering a strained smile. But I noticed how his gaze turned colder, almost distant. George, in contrast, seemed to fill the space with a warmth that instantly eased the tension. "Come on in," George said, gesturing towards the house. "You've had a long drive. The kettle's already on." The house greeted us with the scent of wood, the faint smokiness of a lit fireplace, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. But what struck me most wasn't the smell. It was the feeling. For the first time in a long while, I felt at home. George wasn't just a welcoming host. He was the embodiment of warmth and tranquility. In his faded jeans and rolled-up shirt sleeves, he looked like a man accustomed to working with his hands. Yet there was something almost refined in the way he moved. Even his voice, deep and slightly raspy, carried a calmness that could soothe any storm. "Luke, you've changed a lot since the last time I saw you," George said, patting him on the shoulder. His words could have been a compliment, but I caught an undertone. Luke merely smiled tightly, clearly avoiding any deeper engagement in the conversation. "Work has its demands," he replied, adjusting his shirt cuff. "There's no time for much else." George nodded, but his gaze shifted to me. "And what about you, Kate? Have you adjusted to the pace of San Francisco?" "It's a city that doesn't let you relax," I replied, trying not to let my exhaustion show. "But it can be overwhelming at times." "That's exactly why I escaped here," George said with a faint smile. "This house reminds me that the simple things in life are what really matter." Luke took his coffee and moved to the window, staring out at the backyard. His absence in the conversation left a noticeable void, one that George seemed to fill effortlessly with his presence. He invited me to take a tour of the house, leaving Luke to his own thoughts. George's house surprised me with its atmosphere. It felt like a relic from another era, an old gramophone with a collection of records, roughly hewn wooden furniture, and books with worn pages. On a shelf, I noticed photographs. George with someone, captured in his youth, with a group of friends, or out in nature. I stared at them longer than I intended, unable to help myself. That was from my hike through Yosemite, he explained, noticing my interest. I just divorced Luke's mother then. Decided it was time to make a drastic change. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. George's personal revelations were delivered so naturally that I felt a pang of shame for my own uncertainties. Did you find what you were looking for here? I asked, eager to keep the conversation going. I think so, he said, thoughtfully studying one of the photos. It's not a perfect life, but it feels more real. His words lingered in my mind. I looked at his hands, strong, calloused, clearly shaped by physical labor. George seemed like a man who valued actions over words, a stark contrast to Luke, who was increasingly retreating into his own world. We returned to the kitchen, where Luke was still standing by the window. He glanced at us, but said nothing. I sensed that the silent exchange between him and George carried more weight than any spoken words could. George, however, seemed unbothered and kept up his friendly demeanor. Kate, if you're interested, I could show you the town tomorrow, George offered. There are some interesting places here, especially if you like old things. Why not? I replied, surprised by how at ease I felt around him. Luke remained silent, but I noticed the way he crossed his arms over his chest, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it seemed as though he was about to say something, but instead he simply nodded, leaving me to wonder what was going through his mind. The next day, I woke up earlier than usual. Soft light filtered through the curtains, and the sound of birdsong drifted in through the window. The urban cacophony of morning traffic was replaced here by the sounds of nature, and the stillness felt almost unsettling. Silence was something I wasn't used to. Luke was still asleep, his laptop sitting on the bedside table like a reminder that even in this house he couldn't entirely let go of work. I slipped out of the room quietly, careful not to wake him. The kitchen greeted me with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. George was already up, dressed simply in a t-shirt and work pants. He stood by the window with a mug in hand, exuding a calm that suggested every morning of his began this way, with an unhurried enjoyment of the moment. Good morning, he said, turning to me. You're an early riser, it seems. Good morning. Not really, but here, it feels easier to wake up, I admitted, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. George nodded and placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of me. On the table was a neatly folded newspaper and a box of homemade muffins. Everything felt timeless, as if this place had remained unchanged for decades, where time itself had paused. I promise to show you around town if you're still interested, he said, sitting across from me. Of course, I'd love that. I've always enjoyed exploring new places, I replied, a flicker of excitement in my voice. An hour later, we were strolling through the narrow streets of the town. George narrated the history of every building, recounting who had built it and who had lived there. His attention to detail was astonishing. It wasn't just a string of facts. It was storytelling that made the history come alive. I felt like a character in a film about small-town America, where everyone knows everyone, and the past is forever intertwined with the present. See that shop? He pointed to a small building with a faded sign. When I first moved here, that was where the whole town would gather. It's closed now, but back then they served the best pecan pie you've ever had. I smiled, imagining the scene. The way George spoke made it all so vivid in my mind. After the walk, he brought me to his garage. I had noticed the building earlier, a modest structure made of red brick, with faded metal doors and a sign that barely read, George's Workshop. This is my little kingdom, he said with a touch of pride as he opened the doors. Inside, the space was surprisingly organized despite the abundance of tools, old parts, and dust-covered cars. In the center stood a Ford Mustang, its body gleaming faintly in the sunlight streaming through the windows. "Are you restoring it yourself?" I asked, approaching the car. "Yeah, it's been here since I moved in. It's kind of my project. A reminder, I guess, that even old things can come back to life if you put in enough time and effort." I ran my hand over the cool metal of the hood, feeling the weight of his words. There was something magnetic about this place. George began explaining the restoration process, pointing out various parts and their history, but I only half listened. What struck me most was how genuinely passionate he was. It's rare to see someone so engrossed in what they love. "Is this work or a hobby for you?" I asked, watching his movements closely. "It's my way of reminding myself to slow down and do something just for the soul," he replied, looking up. His words resonated deeply. They felt directed at me, though he hadn't said them with that intention. When was the last time I did something for myself? Not for Luke, not for work, but just to feel alive? That evening, back at the house, I couldn't help but notice how cozy it all felt. The old books on the shelves, the gramophone in the corner, the faded photographs. It all imbued the home with a sense of history and warmth. I asked George why he kept such a decor, and he simply shrugged. "These things remind me of who I am," he said. "Sometimes we need to look back to move forward." His words struck a chord. I glanced at Luke, who was sitting in the corner of the room, engrossed in his laptop. Our worlds suddenly seemed miles apart. George and his home had become a symbol of something genuine, something I realized I had been missing in my life for far too long. After dinner, the three of us moved to the living room. George lit the fireplace, and soon the crackling of the flames filled the room with a soft, soothing rhythm. Luke, as usual, retreated to his room with his laptop, citing urgent work. It wasn't the first time that day, and I had almost stopped being surprised by his detachment. George stayed behind, offering me a cup of herbal tea. I settled into an armchair, the warmth of the fire pleasantly radiating against my skin. George sat across from me, his face illuminated by the flickering light of the flames. We started with small talk. About the weather, a book I'd recently read, the little town where he lived. But gradually, the conversation deepened. "Katie," he began after sipping his tea, "are you happy in San Francisco?" The question caught me off guard with its simplicity. I took a sip of tea, hoping to buy myself some time to answer. "I'm not sure," I finally admitted. "Sometimes it feels like Luke and I are just coexisting, not really living. He's consumed by work, and I don't know if this is the life I wanted." George nodded, remaining silent. He was an excellent listener, and his silence seemed to encourage me to keep going. "You know, I sometimes feel like we lost each other long before it became obvious. We've both been so busy that we forgot how to actually be together," I added, the confession feeling startlingly raw. "That's hard," George said after a long pause. "I've been through something similar. With Luke's mother, we tried to hold on to our marriage for his sake, but at some point it became clear that we didn't understand each other anymore. We'd become strangers." His words were unexpectedly candid. George spoke without bitterness, with a strange sort of wisdom, as though he had long since come to terms with his mistakes and their consequences. "What did you do then?" I asked. "I chose peace," he said simply. "We separated, and I decided to start over here. It wasn't easy, but sometimes change is the only way forward." I didn't know what to say. His words lingered in my mind, leaving a bitter aftertaste. I suddenly felt small and lost, as though I were standing at a crossroads without knowing which way to go. "You're a strong person, George," I said at last, finding my voice. He chuckled softly, but there was no arrogance in his smile, only gentleness. "No, Kate, I just made a choice. That's not strength. It's necessity." We fell silent again. The fire crackled, casting whimsical shadows on the walls. In the quiet, I felt something inside me begin to shift. imperceptibly, yet undeniably. George wasn't just a man who had found his path. He was someone who had learned to live with himself. And I realized that I no longer knew how to do that. Finally, I rose to go to my room. George watched me with a gaze that held more than just kindness. There was understanding in his eyes, a recognition of what was stirring in my soul, even if I couldn't fully grasp it myself. When I returned to Luke, he was seated at his laptop, completely absorbed by the screen. I looked at him, trying to summon the closeness we once shared. But instead, all I felt was emptiness. That night, I lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind rustling the leaves outside the window. George was right. Sometimes change is the only way forward. But was I ready for it? The next morning, Luke was once again lost in his work, his absence filling the house with a strange tension despite everything seeming outwardly normal. Breakfast passed in silence, and to avoid feeling trapped by my own thoughts, I accepted George's offer to help him in the garage. It felt like a kind of escape. From Luke, from the questions I was too afraid to ask myself. George met me at the workshop door, dressed in an old t-shirt and faded jeans. His warm smile instantly melted away my internal discomfort. "Glad you decided to join me," he said, gesturing toward the centerpiece of his attention, the same Ford Mustang he'd been working on. "We've got some engine work to do. Think you can help?" "I'm not sure I know much about cars," I admitted as I stepped into the workshop. "That's all right," he replied. "All you need is the willingness to learn. I'll take care of the rest." He led me to a workbench cluttered with tools and began explaining the intricacies of the engine. His voice was calm and steady, and I found myself enjoying the way he explained things. Even technical details sounded interesting, as though he wasn't just teaching, but sharing a part of his world with me. Gradually, we moved on to the task at hand. I held the flashlight while he inspected something under the hood. Our conversation wandered freely, from old movies to his youth and how he first fell in love with cars. "You know, this isn't just a hobby," he said, wiping his hands with a rag. "It's a way to find peace. Sometimes when everything around you feels like it's falling apart, your hands can still create, fix something. It's a reminder that life can be rebuilt." His words struck a deep, unexpected chord within me. My chest tightened as I realized how much my life felt broken, and how afraid I was to even try to fix it. "Don't you worry it'll all be for nothing? Like working without a guarantee it'll pay off?" I asked. He smiled and paused, looking at me for a moment. "The only time it's for nothing is when you don't believe in it yourself. Everything else? It's just part of the process." His gaze lingered on me longer than it should have. We continued working, but now every phrase, every movement seemed to carry a weight it hadn't before. Something invisible yet palpable hung in the air between us. Occasionally, our hands would brush against each other, and I noticed those fleeting touches lingered in my mind longer than they should. At one point, he pulled an old photograph from a box. It showed a younger version of himself, beaming with a bright smile and eyes full of life. "This was my first car," he said, his voice softer. "We drove across the country in it, me and my friends. Those were different times, more freedom, less fear." I stared at the photo, then at him, and suddenly it felt hard to breathe. There was a vitality in his eyes that I hadn't felt in my own for a long time. Thoughts of Luke suddenly became unbearable, and I quickly turned away, pretending to focus on something else. When we finally finished, I felt a mix of relief and disappointment. George turned to me, his gaze too honest, too open. "Thanks for your help," he said. "It was nothing," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to betray my own confusion. I left the workshop, but the feelings I had experienced there stayed with me. They lingered throughout the day, unsettling and inescapable, refusing to let me go. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Luke left for a business meeting in a nearby town. His departure was swift and emotionless. A few curt phrases, a dry kiss on the cheek, and then his car disappeared down the dusty road. I stood watching him leave, feeling the growing emptiness inside me. The house settled into silence, broken only by the wind and the occasional chirping of birds. I decided to tidy up the kitchen, hoping to distract myself. To my surprise, George walked in a few minutes later. His presence was unexpected, but instead of unsettling me, it brought an inexplicable sense of calm. "Mind if I keep you company?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Of course not," I replied, continuing to wash the dishes, though my hands trembled slightly. He stepped closer but kept a respectful distance, near enough for me to feel his presence, but far enough not to intrude. "You look tired," he said gently, his eyes never leaving me. "It's just been a long day." I tried to brush it off, but there was something in his voice that stopped me. "It's not the day, Kate. You're carrying a weight that's pulling you down. It's written all over you." His words struck a nerve. I wasn't sure where the sudden honesty came from, but I felt a wave of relief at not needing to hide anymore. "You're right," I said softly, letting my hands rest in the soapy water. "Sometimes I feel like I'm losing myself. Losing Luke and me. What we used to have. Everything that once mattered now feels distant." George stayed silent, giving me the space to continue, his quiet presence urging me on. "I don't even think he notices," I added, my voice catching as tears threatened to rise. "We're just living parallel lives, and it terrifies me." I turned to face him, hoping for an answer or at least some kind of understanding in his expression. And I found it. But there was more than just understanding in his eyes. There was warmth, a deep and genuine warmth that seemed to reach into me. "You know, Kate," he began carefully, "sometimes we get so caught up in what's supposed to be right that we forget to think about what actually makes us happy." The simplicity of his words hit me like a revelation, cutting straight to the heart of my unease. "I don't want to come between you and Luke," he added, his voice quieter now. "But I need you to know, you're not alone in feeling this way." I didn't know how to respond. I stood there, letting his words hang in the air between us, feeling them settle into the cracks I had tried to ignore. George took a small step back, easing the intensity of the moment, but something inside me had already shifted. "Thank you, George." I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're welcome," he said with a soft smile before turning to leave. As he walked out of the kitchen, I remained standing there. This time I didn't feel lonely. On the contrary, his words stayed with me, echoing in my mind like a quiet but unyielding truth. I sat at the table for a long time, as the evening darkness gradually consumed the house. The feelings I'd been suppressing could no longer be ignored. Something deep within me was stirring, breaking through the walls I'd carefully built, forcing me to confront the question I had been avoiding. Who did I truly want to be? The morning began with an attempt to distract myself. Luke had returned just before dawn, greeted me briefly, and then immediately dove back into work. His muffled voice, caught in yet another phone call, drifted in from the next room, blending with the familiar hum of the coffee machine. I tried to ignore his detachment, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. From the start of the day, I avoided George. The previous evening had left me with a strange, unshakable mix of unease and warmth that I couldn't explain. His words, his gaze, they lingered in me like an invisible shadow, forcing me to confront feelings I wasn't ready to face. But avoiding him proved impossible. By midday, I went down to the kitchen to prepare lunch and found George there, carefully laying out fresh vegetables on the counter. He glanced at me and smiled as though nothing had happened the night before. "Good morning," he said calmly, as if reading my thoughts. "How did you sleep?" "Good morning," I replied, trying to match his ease. "Well enough." He nodded and returned to his task, not rushing to start a conversation. Yet the silence between us felt different, charged with unspoken words. As I began cooking, he stepped closer. Not too close, but enough for me to feel his presence. "Do you like cooking?" he asked, his tone filled with genuine curiosity. "Sometimes," I answered, chopping the vegetables a bit too finely in my nervousness. "It's more of a necessity than a passion." "Then it's just one more thing where you limit yourself," he said thoughtfully with a faint smile. I froze. His words weren't accusatory, but they struck deep, carrying a truth I couldn't deny. "And you?" I asked, trying to shift the focus and lighten the mood. "What does cooking mean to you?" "It's time to think," he replied. "When you're slicing vegetables or waiting for the water to boil, your thoughts tend to clear." His answer brought a small smile to my face, and I realized that despite my attempts to keep my distance, talking to him always felt natural. Every glance, every small gesture seemed to carry an unspoken weight. I caught myself waiting for his words, then fearing them when they came. When Luke finally emerged from his room, I felt a wave of relief, quickly replaced by fresh anxiety. He looked at us, me standing by the stove and George helping at the counter, with a strange intensity in his gaze. "What are you two doing?" he asked, attempting to sound casual. "Just making lunch," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Together?" he pressed, this time looking directly at George. "You were busy," George replied evenly. "I thought I'd lend a hand." Luke didn't respond. He stepped closer, glancing between me and George, and I realized that his suspicions were beginning to take root. Lunch passed in a heavy, oppressive silence. Luke focused on his plate, occasionally shooting quick, probing glances at George and me. It was as if he were waiting, trying to piece something together. After lunch, he retreated back to his work, but the atmosphere in the house had become almost unbearable. That evening, I sat on the porch, hoping to find some peace in the sounds of nature. George joined me after a while, wordlessly settling into the chair beside mine. His presence spoke volumes, though he said nothing. Together, we watched the horizon darken, and I felt the undeniable weight of something forbidden growing between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "You deserve to be happy, Kate." His words shattered me. A wave of emotion surged within, and I realized that my fear could no longer conceal the truth. The next morning at breakfast, Luke announced that he needed to go to the nearby town to handle some urgent work issues. He spoke while staring off to the side, as if avoiding meeting my gaze. "How long will you be gone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably until late evening," he replied. His tone was dry, almost mechanical. "You two can enjoy some time to relax here." Though he addressed us both, I felt that his words were more directed at George. When Luke left, the house felt lighter, as though a heavy weight had been lifted. It was a strange sensation, relief at his absence mixed with guilt. I tried to busy myself, reading, tidying up, wandering the garden, but everything I did felt shallow, as if I were merely going through the motions. After lunch, George suggested a walk around the property. I wanted to find an excuse to decline, but couldn't. His gentle insistence disarmed me in a way I didn't expect. We followed a trail that led into the woods. A light breeze swayed the treetops, and the crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound. George walked beside me, and I realized how calm I felt in his presence, as though he had a way of silencing my fears without even speaking. "It's beautiful here," I said, gazing up at the towering trees. "I come here often," he replied, his voice quiet. "This place reminds me that you can get through anything in life." I turned to look at him and saw how the light reflected in his eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had been through a great deal but had learned how to endure. "Do you always see things so wisely?" I asked with a small smile, trying to turn the conversation into a joke. "No," he said, smiling back. "I've just learned to focus on what matters." His words resonated deeply, touching something raw and vulnerable within me. We continued walking, and the silence between us no longer felt heavy. It was filled with something unspoken, yet undeniable. By the time we returned home, the day was fading into evening. George suggested making dinner together, and I agreed. We worked side by side, just as we had the day before, but this time the atmosphere was different. Every interaction, every movement between us seemed to carry an unspoken weight. At one point, as I was chopping vegetables, his hand brushed lightly against mine. It was just a fleeting touch, but it made my breath catch. I looked up and our eyes met. "Katie," he began, but his voice faltered. I knew what he wanted to say, but I couldn't let him. "Don't," I said softly, lowering my gaze. We fell into silence. Later, I excused myself and retreated to my room, claiming I was tired. But it was a lie. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window, feeling the storm inside me. George was right. I deserved to be happy. But I also understood that the happiness he could offer came with a cost. That night was longer than any before. With each passing moment, I felt myself teetering on the edge of something. A boundary I couldn't bring myself to cross, but one I could no longer step away from either. Late that evening, when the house had already sunk into darkness, a soft knock at my door startled me. My heart jumped, but when I heard George's voice, a strange sense of relief washed over me. "Katie, I'm sorry to bother you. Could you help me in the garage?" I hesitated, but after a moment I rose from the bed. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door to find him standing there. He seemed calm, yet there was something in his eyes that unsettled me, something I both feared and couldn't ignore. "Of course," I replied, trying to sound casual. We walked to the garage in silence. The quiet around us was almost absolute, broken only by the sound of our breathing and the crunch of our steps on the gravel. Inside the garage, a dim light illuminated the space, casting shadows that flickered on the walls. The Ford Mustang stood in the center of the room, a silent witness to whatever was about to unfold. George explained that he needed me to hold a flashlight while he tightened some bolts. I picked up the flashlight, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to steady them. We worked quietly, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. I focused on the task, but I could feel his occasional glances, each one sending a ripple through my resolve. "You know," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness, "sometimes I think certain moments in life happen for a reason." His words echoed my own unspoken thoughts. I didn't respond, unsure of what to say, or perhaps too afraid to say anything at all. "Do you feel it too, Katie?" he asked, his voice low but steady as he lifted his head to look at me. I lowered the flashlight, unable to meet his gaze. "George, I don't know what to say," I whispered. The next morning, I woke up later than usual. My head felt heavy, burdened not by sleep, but by the weight of my thoughts. Luke had returned early. His suitcase stood by the door, and he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, engrossed in his phone. George was absent, and I felt a strange relief that I wouldn't have to face him right away. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound natural. "Yeah," Luke muttered without looking up. The silence in the house was deafening. I busied myself making breakfast, pretending not to notice, but I could feel Luke glancing at me occasionally. His looks felt probing, as though he were trying to figure something out. By midday, I retreated to the porch with a book, hoping to distract myself. The quiet seemed to stretch endlessly, but it was soon broken. Luke stepped out, phone in hand, and the moment I saw his face, I knew something was wrong. "Is there something you want to tell me?" he asked, his voice steady but his gaze piercing. "What do you mean?" I tried to keep my composure, but my voice betrayed my unease. "About why there's a message in your phone to George," he said, his tone cold and clipped, "where you talk about your feelings." The world seemed to stop. My face drained of color, and I felt a deep, sickening twist in my stomach. "Luke, it's not what you think," I began, but my words sounded weak, even to me. "Then explain to me what it is," he demanded, his voice rising, his anger now unmistakable. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. My silence was all the confirmation he needed. His eyes burned with a mix of rage and hurt. "George? Seriously?" he said, stepping closer, his voice incredulous and filled with bitterness. Of all people, George? At that moment, the door opened and George walked in. His face immediately registered the tension in the room. His eyes moved from me to Luke, sensing the storm. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice cautious. "Why don't you tell me, George?" Luke shot back, turning toward him. "You and my wife? What exactly were you thinking? Planning some kind of betrayal under my own roof?" "Luke, calm down," George said, raising a hand. His voice was firm but steady. "This isn't what you think." "Oh, it's not?" Luke laughed bitterly. "It's betrayal, George. You were supposed to be an example, a guide. Instead, this?" I tried to speak, but Luke held up a hand to silence me. "Do you want to tell me it doesn't matter? That it was just a mistake?" He continued, his voice now directed at me. "I can't explain what I feel," I said quietly, finally finding my voice. "I'm confused myself." "You've destroyed everything," Luke said, his voice filled with exhaustion more than anger now. "I knew we had problems, but I never thought you'd go this far." George stepped in again, his voice calm but weighted. "Luke, I'm not making excuses, but I'm responsible too. I let this go too far." "Too far?" Luke interrupted with venom. "You don't even know the meaning of those words." Without another word, Luke turned and left, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. George looked at me, his expression filled with something between regret and guilt, but I couldn't meet his gaze. "This wasn't how it was supposed to end," he said softly before walking out of the room. I was left alone, enveloped in a crushing silence. It felt like the weight of everything, my choices, my mistakes, was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I knew I had disappointed everyone, but worse than that, I couldn't justify what I had done. This was the end of my marriage, of the person I thought I was. There was no going back.